The story takes place in a small town surrounded by dense forests and mountains. Clara's house is an old Victorian-style building with narrow corridors, creaky wooden stairs, and a dark basement rarely visited. Mrs. Marta's antique shop is filled with old objects, with a musty smell and an air of mystery. Clara loved visiting Mrs. Marta's shop. There was something magical about that place, a mixture of curiosity and fear that attracted her. On a rainy afternoon, while exploring the back section, she found an old doll covered in dust. It was a porcelain doll with green glass eyes that seemed to follow her movements. Its blonde hair was almost lifelike, and the blue lace dress, though worn by time, still retained an air of dark elegance. "That doll has a sad story," said Mrs. Marta, appearing out of nowhere as she often did. "It belonged to a girl who lived in this town many years ago. They say the girl and the doll were so connected that when the girl died, her spirit got trapped inside the doll." Marina hesitated, but Clara insisted so much that they ended up taking the doll home. That night, Clara placed the doll on her shelf, next to her other toys. However, as she lay down, she felt a strange sensation, as if she were being watched. In the first few nights, Clara had nightmares. She dreamed of a girl crying in a dark room, asking for help. With each nightmare, Clara woke up, feeling the doll was closer to her bed. One morning, Marina found Clara sleeping on the floor, away from the shelf. Worried, Marina decided to lock the doll in the basement. However, the events only worsened. Clara began hearing whispers at night, voices seemingly coming from the basement, calling her name. Objects in the house moved on their own, doors opened and closed by themselves, and inexplicable shadows appeared in mirrors. Desperate, Marina called her mother, Sophia, for help. Sophia, knowledgeable about local legends, immediately recognized the signs. "That doll isn't just haunted. It's a portal. Something evil is trying to cross over," Sophia warned. They decided to burn the doll, but when they went down to the basement, they found it turned upside down. The doll sat in the center of the room, with a malicious smile on its porcelain face. Before they could act, the basement door slammed shut, locking them inside. The lights flickered, plunging them into darkness. Clara began to scream, feeling invisible hands pulling her hair and scratching her skin. Marina and Sophia tried to protect her, but were pushed by an invisible force. The doll, now standing, slowly advanced, its glass eyes glowing a sinister green. In the midst of the chaos, Clara heard the voice of the girl from her dream. "Help me," the voice whispered, desperate. With one last cry of courage, Clara managed to grab the doll and, in a rush, threw it against the wall. The doll shattered into 1,000 pieces, but instead of relief, a wave of darkness flooded the room. The basement floor began to crack, revealing a dark abyss from which spectral hands emerged, trying to pull Clara down. Marina and Sophia fought to hold her, feeling the temperature drop drastically, and a cold mist covered the floor. Suddenly, a deadly silence fell over the room. The only sound was their heavy breathing. When the lights finally returned, they realized they were alone. The doll had disappeared, but the blood marks and scratches on their skins were real. They climbed the stairs, trembling, and as they reached the top, they heard a child's laughter echoing through the house. The basement doors slowly closed behind them with a sinister creak. The house was silent, but the feeling of being watched never disappeared. The doll might have been destroyed, but something evil had been released. Clara knew the fight was far from over. The true terror was just beginning. In the days following the terrifying encounter in the basement, the atmosphere in Clara's home grew increasingly oppressive. Shadows seemed to move with a mind of their own, and the once warm, inviting house now felt like a dark labyrinth of fear. Clara barely slept, her nights filled with the haunting laughter and whispers that echoed through the halls. Marina, desperate to protect her daughter, sought the help of Father Gabriel, the local priest. Known for his expertise in dealing with supernatural occurrences, Father Gabriel had a reputation for confronting the darkest forces. When he arrived at the house, his expression turned grave as he sensed the malevolent presence. "This house is under the influence of a powerful evil," Father Gabriel said, his voice steady but filled with concern. We must perform a cleansing ritual to expel whatever is haunting you." That night, Father Gabriel began the ritual. Candles were placed in a circle in the living room, and he recited prayers in Latin, his voice resonating with authority. Clara, Marina, and Sophia watched anxiously as the flames flickered and the air grew cold. Suddenly, the room was plunged into darkness. The candles extinguished simultaneously, and an icy wind swept through the house. Clara felt a cold hand on her shoulder and screamed, only to see the faint outline of the doll's face in the shadows, its eyes gleaming with malevolence. Father Gabriel continued his prayers, his voice rising above the growing cacophony of ghostly whispers and cries. The furniture began to shake violently, and pictures flew off the walls, shattering on the floor. A deep, guttural voice echoed through the room, mocking the priest's efforts. "You cannot banish me," the voice growled. "This house is mine." As Father Gabriel fought to maintain his focus, Clara saw a vision of the little girl from her nightmares. The girl stood at the edge of the room, her face tear-streaked and eyes pleading. "Help me," she whispered again. Clara, driven by a surge of determination, stepped forward into the circle of candles, breaking the barrier. She reached out to the apparition of the girl, feeling a strange connection, as if their fates were intertwined. At that moment, the room was filled with a blinding light. The oppressive force seemed to recoil, and the doll's face twisted in rage before disappearing into the shadows. The light faded, leaving Clara, Marina, Sophia, and Father Gabriel standing in the now silent and still room. "It's over," Marina whispered, hugging Clara tightly, but Father Gabriel shook his head. "No," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of what they had faced. "The immediate threat is gone, but the spirit of the doll still lingers. It's bound to something in this house." Over the next few days, they searched every corner of the house, looking for any object that might still be connected to the doll's malevolent spirit. In the attic, hidden beneath old furniture and forgotten memories, they found a dusty, old chest. Inside was a diary, its pages yellowed with age. The diary belonged to the little girl from Clara's nightmares. It detailed her life, her bond with the doll, and the tragic events leading to her death. The final entry was a chilling warning about the doll's true nature, revealing it was a vessel for an ancient and vengeful spirit. Realizing they needed to know more about the spirit, they turned once again to Mrs. Marta, hoping she held the key to the doll's dark past. As they entered her antique shop, Mrs. Marta looked up, her face a mask of concern. "I was expecting you," she said ominously. "There's much you need to know, but be warned. The truth may be more terrifying than you can imagine." Mrs. Marta led them to a back room of her antique shop, a place filled with relics and artifacts that seemed to whisper secrets from the past. She carefully pulled out an old, leather-bound book, its cover adorned with cryptic symbols and worn edges. "This is the Grimoire of Shadows," she explained, her voice hushed. "It contains knowledge of ancient spirits and dark forces. The spirit within the doll is known as Belisara, an ancient entity that feeds on fear and suffering. It was bound to the doll centuries ago by a sorcerer seeking to harness its power." As Mrs. Marta turned the fragile pages, she revealed illustrations and incantations related to binding and banishing spirits. One page caught Clara's eye, a depiction of a young girl holding a doll, surrounded by dark, swirling shadows. "That's her," Clara whispered. "The girl from my nightmares." Mrs. Marta nodded solemnly. Her name was Elise. She was an innocent soul caught in the sorcerer's twisted experiment. When she died, her spirit became trapped with Belisara, creating a powerful and dangerous bond. Father Gabriel leaned in, studying the text. "We need to sever that bond and free Elise's spirit. Only then can we hope to banish Belisara for good." The instructions were clear but perilous. They needed to perform a ritual at the place where Elise had died, using a combination of ancient chants and a personal item of hers, which was in the chest they found in the attic. That night, armed with the grimoire, the diary, and Elise's locket, they made their way to the abandoned house where Elise had lived and died. The house was a decrepit, crumbling structure at the edge of town, its windows dark and foreboding. As they entered, the air grew colder, and the oppressive feeling of being watched intensified. Father Gabriel set up the ritual space in the center of what had once been Elise's bedroom. The walls were covered in faded, peeling wallpaper, and the remnants of a child's life lay scattered on the floor. Broken toys, a dusty bed, and tattered curtains. With candles lit and the locket placed in the center, Father Gabriel began the incantation. Mrs. Marta joined in, her voice blending with his in a haunting chant that seemed to vibrate through the walls. Clara, Marina, and Sophia formed a protective circle around them, holding hands and praying for strength. The air thickened with an almost tangible darkness. The shadows in the corners of the room began to writhe and twist, coalescing into a towering figure with burning red eyes. Belisara had arrived. "You dare to challenge me?" the spirit's voice boomed, shaking the very foundation of the house. Father Gabriel's voice grew louder, more insistent. The candles flickered wildly, and the temperature plummeted. Clara felt a hand on her shoulder. Elise's ghostly form stood beside her, her eyes filled with both fear and hope. "Help me!" Elise's voice echoed once more, a plea that resonated deep within Clara's heart. Summoning all her courage, Clara stepped forward, breaking the circle again. She held Elise's locket tightly, focusing on the image of the girl's face in her mind. "Elise, you are not alone. We will free you." A blinding light emanated from the locket, illuminating the room and causing Belisara to recoil in rage. The spirit roared, thrashing against the invisible bonds created by the ritual. Father Gabriel's voice reached a crescendo, the final words of the incantation ringing out like a clarion call. "In the name of the light, I banish you, Belisara, to the void from whence you came." With a deafening scream, Belisara's form began to dissolve, the shadows dissipating into nothingness. The room was flooded with a purifying light, and as the last of the darkness faded, Elise's spirit smiled, a look of peace and gratitude on her face. "Thank you," she whispered, before fading away, her soul finally free. The oppressive feeling lifted, and the house seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. The candles burned steadily, their light warm and comforting. Father Gabriel lowered his hands, exhausted but victorious. "It's done," he said, looking at the relieved faces around him. But as they turned to leave, Clara noticed something strange. One of the shadows near the doorway lingered, darker and more defined than the rest. It moved slightly, almost imperceptibly, as if watching them. "Mom," Clara said, her voice trembling, "I think it's not over." As they left the decrepit house, an eerie silence enveloped them. The lingering shadow felt like a cold breath on the back of their necks, but they pressed on, determined to leave the darkness behind. Back at Clara's home, they hoped for a return to normalcy. Days passed with an uneasy calm. Clara slept better, the nightmares receding, and the house felt lighter, almost as if a heavy shroud had been lifted. Yet, the memory of the lingering shadow gnawed at them. One evening, Clara noticed something peculiar. Her once vivid drawings of the doll and the dark figure had returned, scattered across her room, despite her having torn them up. Her heart raced as she realized the same cold sensation from the basement was creeping back. Marina, sensing Clara's distress, decided it was time for drastic measures. They returned to Mrs. Marta's shop, seeking final guidance. Mrs. Marta, having anticipated their return, presented them with one last piece of advice. "Belisara's spirit may be gone, but its influence remains," Mrs. Marta said, her eyes dark with concern. "You must find and destroy the source of its power." The doll was merely a vessel, but the true artifact binding Belisara lies deeper. The only clue they had was in Elise's diary. As they pored over the fragile pages once more, Clara discovered a passage she had missed. It spoke of a cursed amulet, hidden within the grounds of the sorcerer's original home, a place long abandoned and overgrown in the forest outside town. Armed with this knowledge, they ventured into the forest. The ancient trees loomed over them, their branches like skeletal hands reaching out. The path was barely visible, choked with vines and brambles. As night fell, the forest grew unnaturally silent. At the heart of the forest, they found the ruins of an old stone house, almost completely swallowed by nature. A sense of dread hung in the air, thicker than ever. They knew the amulet had to be somewhere within. Father Gabriel led the search, his faith unshaken. In the ruins of the cellar, hidden beneath layers of dirt and debris, they uncovered a small wooden box engraved with the same symbols as the grimoire. Inside lay the amulet, its dark crystal pulsing faintly with a malevolent energy. As soon as Clara touched it, a freezing wave of darkness swept through the cellar. The shadows coalesced into a figure, more menacing and solid than before. Belisara, enraged by their intrusion. "You will not take it from me." Belisara's voice boomed, shaking the very walls. Father Gabriel began to recite an exorcism, but Belisara's power was stronger than before. The ground trembled, and the air crackled with dark energy. Clara, driven by an unexplainable courage, stepped forward. Holding the amulet tightly, she shouted, "Elise, help me! Together we can end this." A ghostly light appeared beside Clara, the spirit of Elise, her eyes filled with determination. She reached out, placing her spectral hand over Clara's. With a blinding flash, the amulet shattered. A deafening scream filled the air as Belisara's form disintegrated, torn apart by the combined forces of Clara's bravery and Elise's spirit. The darkness lifted, the oppressive force evaporating into nothingness. The forest seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, the trees swaying gently as if thanking them. Exhausted but victorious, they returned home. The lingering shadows were gone, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the house was filled with a sense of peace and safety. Clara slept soundly that night, free from nightmares. In her dreams, she saw Elise one last time, smiling and waving goodbye. The bond had been broken, and the spirits were finally at rest. Marina, Sophia, and Clara thanked Father Gabriel and Mrs. Marta for their unwavering support and guidance. The haunted doll was no more, and Belisara's terror had been vanquished. Yet, as a final precaution, they decided to bury the remnants of the amulet and the grimoire in a consecrated ground, ensuring the evil would never rise again. As they stood by the gravesite, Father Gabriel offered a prayer, sealing their victory and the protection over their future. "This is the end," Marina whispered, holding Clara close. "Or maybe," Clara said softly, "it's a new beginning." And with that, they turned away from the past, walking towards a future free from the shadows of the haunted doll. The true horror had been defeated, leaving only the strength and courage they had discovered within themselves.